Correct, yes.
The governors in Yoruba land, they are not Fulanis. But the situation in Yoruba land is not different from what you'd find in the Fulani feudal construct. So you have rulers who are unelected by those who should be citizens, but you cannot have citizens where you do not have the protection of equality of law. So if the law does not rule, and you cannot have citizens, you cannot have a democracy, but you still have some semblance of governance that pretends to be a democracy. But when you break it down properly, you find that it is a constitutional feudal state where the judiciary does exactly as the executive demands. And when I say the executive, I'm talking about the presidency, where the president does exactly as he cares, even when it is obviously in contradiction to the position of the constitution. I warrant that the National Assembly would sanction this madness. I think it's section 315 or 305, whichever one they are using for their impeachment, for their state of emergency.
Yes.
It provides that the National Assembly would have to endorse what the president has done. That is assuming he had even acted within his powers, which he hasn't. But this toothless Congress of baboons will do exactly as they are told by the time Akpabio is done transferring prayers to their boxes. And you will call that a democracy. It's not a democracy. We are not in a democracy. The reality is that Nigeria is a feudal state. It's a modern iteration of a feudal state. It's just that they are dishonest and not proud to have to own up to what it is. It's not a democracy.
How do you think it all ends for Wike? Because for me personally, I feel like he's allowed his, will I say, ego or whatever he has, the issues he has with Fubara to kind of
how
become.
It ends?
Yeah, how do you think it all ends for?
In a box. Everybody goes out in a box at the end of the day. Maybe if he's blessed, he might live as long as he has already lived, if he is blessed. But ultimately, regardless of how much you ride roughshod over people, how rich you are, how powerful you are, what you become or do not become, the only thing that is certain and predictable is death. So no matter how long Mr. Wike might go around like an aspiring Hitler, it does not change the fact that a day will come and he will go the way of all mortals, including myself. So that's the only thing that is certain.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer to give, in the sense that when one comes across an kind of insurmountable obstacle, which Wike kind of seems like today,
Wike
like he has the backing of he has the backing of the president. So it seems like he can do anything he wants to do and get away with it, no matter how crazy it may seem. That's how it looks like today.
Yeah, Yorubas have this proverb. They say that when the bata drum becomes strident, it is because it is about to tear asunder. The madness that is being orchestrated in Rivers, we've seen it before.
Yes.
It happened in the First Republic. In actual fact, the powers that the president presumed to deploy yesterday were the powers available in the 1960 Constitution. They are not available in the 1999 fraud. The power to suspend the regional assembly and to remove a sitting premier, which was what was done to precipitate the crisis in the Western region in the lead up to the first coup of January 1966. It was the overreach of Tafawa Balewa as the Prime Minister of Nigeria intervening in the crisis in the Western region on the side of Akintola, his ally, that led to the collapse of the First Republic. When you make it impossible for the law to rule and impunity becomes a governing creed, instability becomes the result. All the political gladiators in Nigeria, the bit part owners of the different fiefdoms that have coalesced together in Nigeria, they're all watching and taking notes. What Wike and Tinubu are telling them is that the constitution, useless as it is, does not offer any protection for them once the president or any one of his minions look in your direction. You have no constitutional protection. Yeah. That is what they have signaled. And when you find a place where people who have money but do not have power are told that they do not have constitutional protection, what you find is that each person begins to seek protection outside the confines of the law. Anarchy looms large as a function of what began yesterday. Yes. But it didn't really begin yesterday, now did it?
I do agree, sir. I do definitely agree.
Similarity wasn't the people's choice.
Yes.
Wike is the imperator. So, a fair recipe for disaster.
Yeah. Another current issue is the ongoing tussle between, I won't really call it a tussle, but the ongoing drama between Natasha and Akpabio. What are your thoughts, sir?
It's none of our business. It's like this similarity and wicked thing.
Yeah.
The only thing it does for us, if anything, is that it offers us the opportunity to see how they operate, how the people governing the people, how they think, if they think at all. That what began as a squabble over a sitting arrangement in the Senate, graduated and became sexual harassment allegation. Once the sexual harassment allegation was made, no matter what you think of Natasha, Akpabio has priors. And I would imagine that simple common sense should have told them that Akpabio should take himself out of the process for determining the response of the Senate. But there he was, being the one reading out the decision of the Senate to indefinitely suspend a member whom they did not elect. So you find that we are in a democracy that is quickly unraveling because men's egos have to be assuaged. The law cannot be allowed to rule. And ultimately, standards cannot be kept because you have to keep changing position every day to suit the whims and caprices of persons. So Natasha, Akpabio, they are just symptoms of what we are witnessing in Nigeria, a systemic collapse, a complete retreat from governance and descent into sensational noise-making at best.
Yeah. I mean, someone you mentioned and someone who I think ties into all these individuals is the president, obviously. And it seems to me that since his election, the facade.
No, sorry. You might be better served to talk about since he's swearing in.
Okay.
Let's talk about his election.
Since he's swearing in, it seems as if the facade of rule of law, the facade of the constitution, it seems as if that facade has been taken away. We're not looking at lawlessness and not seeming to care about the law, not seeming to care about processes, rule of law, even though those things have not really existed in Nigeria. At least there's been kind of a pretense. People kind of pretend to observe those rules or kind of pretend to follow the law. But what do you think of his time so far in office?
If I went out into the sunshine and I was wearing rose-tinted glasses, the day would appear rosy, right? If I went out there wearing green-tinted glasses, I'll probably also see things in green. Long before Bola Ahmed Adekunle Tinubu was sworn into office as the president of Nigeria, even during the months of electioneering, I had warned without any equivocation that the Tinubu presidency would represent a descent into lawlessness. It would represent the end of our democracy, if we ever had any, which we didn't. So that the man has come into power today and everything that shouldn't happen are happening might surprise those who are unprepared for what to expect with his ascension to power. But for those of us who live in Lagos State, we've experienced him firsthand for 26 years, and we know that he has no tolerance for anything called democracy. We know that as a fact. So we had no illusions as to what to expect with him in power. If anything, I think Nigerians should use the current shenanigans in Rivers State to advise themselves as to exactly where they are in their journey to Mogadishu. But that if anyone is expecting that you have any semblance of democracy or rule of law in Nigeria, that will be highly delusional. There is nothing like that again.
When you were talking, you mentioned, I believe it was serfs in one of your answers, and it kind of brought back one of the words you use in this book to describe Nigeria as a feudal state. And I've read two of your books now, this one, Imperatives of the Nigerian Revolution. I really enjoyed this one, in my opinion, compared to the one on the judiciary. But that's my own opinion anyway. I've not read the third one. I couldn't find it on Amazon for whatever reason. It wasn't available. But hopefully, I was some point back because I really enjoyed reading your book. I love the way you write. But what do you mean by Nigeria being a feudal state? Something that was referenced in this particular book quite a lot.
Earlier in my life, I read English language and linguistics as a course. I didn't finish it, but it left me with a lifelong predilection for linguistic exactitude. If you use words, I expect the words to mean what the native speaker of the words intended for it to mean. I know as a fact that you cannot have a democracy where the rule of law does not exist. I also know as a fact that the historical basis of Nigeria's existence is found in feudalism. when the white man came to Nigeria, there were two Islamic empires already in existence in this space called Nigeria today. You had the Kanem Borno Empire, and you also had the Sokoto Caliphate. Both were feudal. Feudalism talks about the acceptable non-equality of social classes. So you have the serfs and you have the rulers. And in between, you have those who serve the rulers. That is what Nigeria is today. I know that it sometimes sounds very difficult for people to wrap their brains around this concept. But when you consider that what began as a Fulani construct has jumped ship, it has jumped host. The rulers of Ala-Igbo are not Fulanis. But the situation in Ala-Igbo is not different from what you find in the land of the Fulanis.
No, I do agree. Definitely agree. I mean, there's no one can't look at Nigeria and call Nigeria democracy. It's not even possible at all. Well, going back to the book again, you mentioned the North. And one of the things I was fascinated about, reading your book is you talked about the veto given to the North by the British when Nigeria was created. I kind of understood what you meant, but for someone who doesn't understand what you mean, what do you mean by the veto that was given to the North?
When you structure a country in a manner that, from the onset, you ensure that at every point in time, the number of seats in the Legislative Assembly would always be that the number in the South, that is a combination of the Eastern region back then and the Western region, or provinces as they were back then, or protectorate, you make sure that where the East had 16 members, the West had 16 members, the North had 32. So at every point in time, even with state creation, you find that that balance is critically maintained. Even in the face of serious demographic questions being asked, how can you have more people living in the desert space than towards the Atlantic coast? But that's why we cannot have a proper population census in our country. So these questions find themselves right at the root of Nigeria's problem. The veto is real. Today, you have 36 states in Nigeria. How many are in the north? How many are in the south? The balance is constantly maintained, and there is no empirical or scientific basis for doing so. It is simply a veto that has been handed over. Not that the people in whose name it was given have ever been the beneficiary of the veto. The beneficiaries have always been the ruling class, because it has always... Don't use the word elite in relation to Nigerians. We don't have an elite class. We have a ruinous class. Yes. They are moneyed. I'm not arguing against the fact that they have money, but having money does not make you elite. It simply makes you moneyed. We don't have an elite class.
No, I do agree. I mean,